Good job, Josh, Emily. I've learned one thing, that good music, when it's done from a contrite heart overflowing with God's provision, it's good music anytime, whether it's Christmas, Easter, or whenever. So, great job. And as far as limitations, Emily, when I was a kid, it went something like, if I've got to tell you that one more time, and I know I wasn't the only one growing up that ever heard those words, but that was pretty much, I knew my limitations then. So anyway, I heard that a lot on my stepbrothers and stepsisters. Wasn't very seldom ever directed to me. So anyway, we're gonna follow up on that this morning and follow up on what Luke preached on last week. And we're going to talk about, Luke said, there's things in the Bible here, and, they're not just directed at the unsaved, non-Christian. They're not just directed at new Christians. They're directed at us. We're to do these things. But, there's many times as Christians, God asks us to do things that doesn't seem to make any sense. And not only do they not make any sense, many times they seem like maybe just the opposite thing that we should do. A few minutes ago, we took up an offering, and we read in the Bible, we come to church, and it says, we should tithe, we should give. Now, God doesn't say if you can afford it. He just says give. And sometimes we look at our situations and our financial situation, and God asks us to give, and we think, well, wait a minute. I already don't have enough money to make ends meet. So when you ask me to give, that just doesn't make any sense at all. And we might think, well, God don't need my money. And you know what? You're right. God can do anything with a blink of an eye. It's not about what God needs. It's about a discipline for us as believers. Or maybe you're here today and you're in some sort of relationship or a job situation, and through God's word or through a sermon or wise counsel, you're told you need to make some changes. And you say, well, when I look at my situation, God, that doesn't make any sense at all. Or maybe you feel like you've been called into the ministry in some fashion, and you're established in your job, but you still feel like God is calling you. But when you look at your situation, in fact, what God is asking just seems like the most irresponsible thing you can do. And as Christians, there comes those critical points in time when God will require us to do things that when we evaluate our circumstances, when we evaluate our finances, when we evaluate all the players involved, it just doesn't seem to make any sense to us. In fact, sometimes it seems like it's the opposite thing that we should do. And today we're going to talk about, how do you respond in those type of situations? And let me say up front that, we serve a very reasonable God, and God doesn't ask us to do things that doesn't make any sense from His perspective. But oftentimes, and this is something that, again, I might change if I was in charge, but oftentimes, God will withhold what we seem to feel like is pertinent information. God seems to withhold the why. Not that we would necessarily obey if we even knew the why. More information doesn't necessarily lead to more obedience. But God sometimes will withhold the why. Not all the time. There are plenty of times in the Bible where He tells us to do this, and you could expect this, or, if you don't do this, you can expect this to happen. Here's how you are to treat your spouse, and here's why, and here's how you conduct your business aspects, and here's why. But every once in a while, we get to a point in our lives where God says, I want you to do this, and everything inside of us seems to rebel. And everything in us, as we evaluate our circumstances, says, God, I'm not mad at you. I don't have anything against you. But that just doesn't make any sense, God. But the thing is, God always has a reason. And in the end, we will always find out his reason. That ultimately we come to a place where we understand and we can look back and go, yeah, that makes perfect sense to me. You know, one of the movies I like is The Hunt for Red October. I don't know if you've seen that or not, but the story is about an American submarine and a Russian submarine. The Russian submarine is trying to defect to the United States, but it doesn't want its government to know what it's doing, so it's trying to do it in secret, and because the Russian submarine thinks if their country finds out, they will come and blow them up so that the Americans can't get that technology. But the American sub and the Russian sub come face to face, and the American sub thought, well, it's time to sink this sub before they sink us. So then, and always, if you watch these movies, they always say, well, how far? Well, the enemy ship is 1,500 yards, arm your torpedoes. Well, the American submarine fires upon the Russian sub, and the commander of the Russian sub does something that seems like it doesn't make any sense at all. He orders his crew full speed ahead toward the incoming torpedoes. And his crew all looks around, probably the same way I'd look around and go, have you lost your mind? But they obey. The Russian sub goes right by, the torpedoes whiz right on by, and a few hundred yards after it passed the sub, they explode. Well, the captain of the Russian sub knew those torpedoes were armed with a mechanism that they didn't explode until they traveled a certain distance, so by closing that gap, he avoided that explosion. But his crew didn't know that, but I'm sure they look back and go, I'm sure glad that I obeyed the captain's orders. And there are times in the Bible, you know, and we're going to talk about a situation in the Old Testament in the book of 2 Kings, if you want to turn there. And it's the story of someone who came to the crossroads, and the solution that he heard for his problem didn't make any sense. And if you're here today and you feel like you're at some sort of crossroads and you need to make a decision, or you know, we've all got kids, we've all got grandkids, and, they come to us and say, well, Mom, Dad, you're older and you're supposed to be smarter, but that doesn't make any sense. We're going to talk to you about, this situation. And it's a story of Naaman. And it's in 2 Kings chapter 5. Now, I'm going to start reading, and we're going to stop and kind of discuss this as we go through it. And this story tells us why God does things and how we're supposed to respond to them. 2 Kings, verse 5. Now Naaman was the commander of the army of the king of Aram. He was a great man in the sight of his master and highly regarded, because through him the Lord had given victory to Aram. He was a valiant soldier, but he had leprosy. Now bands from Aram had gone out and had taken captive a young girl from Israel, and she served Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, if only my master would see the prophet who is in Samaria, he could cure him of his leprosy. So Naaman went to his master and told him what the girl from Israel had said. By all means, the king of Aram replied, I will send a letter to the king of Israel. So Naaman left, taking with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 sets of clothing. So here's the situation. Close to Israel was the land of Aram. And the Arameans evidently didn't like to grow their own crops or mine their own gold or raise their own cattle. And every once in a while, even though there was a peace treaty between the two nations, the Arameans would come over and raid the Israelis, and they'd take their crops and their gold and their silver and whatever they had of value. And every once in a while, they would even bring back with them slaves. And on this one particular raid, they had captured and brought back with them a small girl. Now, she was evidently young enough to quickly grow attached to Naaman and his wife, but she was old enough to remember her homeland. And so she grew up in Naaman's home, and now Naaman was the second most powerful man under the king in the whole nation of Aram. He was a captain of the army, and he suddenly come down with this dreaded disease of leprosy. And it would kind of be like cancer or AIDS in today's society. It was something that not a lot was known about. People were fearful of it. And if you had leprosy, most of the time you became an outcast. So here is this very important, powerful man with leprosy. And this little girl who was taken from Israel was old enough to remember that there was a man in Israel that seemed to have some sort of magical powers that he would probably cure Naaman of his leprosy. So she tells Naaman's wife and all about this man that she remembers, and Naaman's wife goes to Naaman, and Naaman in turn goes and tells the king that evidently there's this guy, there's some magician or something. So the king of Aram said, well, what do we got to lose, Naaman? We'll put together a caravan and some money and some clothing, and I'll send a letter, and we'll send a caravan out, to Israel, to find this powerful man. Now, here's kind of how they thought back in those days. It was God, king, people, earth. That was kind of their hierarchy or their pecking order back then. So the king of Aram figured that if there was a man powerful enough to cure Naaman of his leprosy, then it either must have been the king or it must have been someone that worked directly under the authority of the king. The story goes on, verse 6. The letter that he took to the king of Israel read, "With this letter I am sending my servant Naaman to you so that you can cure him of his leprosy." As soon as the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his robes and said, "Am I God? Can I kill and bring back to life? Why does this fellow send someone to me to be cured of leprosy? See how he is trying to pick a quarrel with me?" So here's the king of Israel sitting on his throne one day, and then walks in Naaman, his arch enemy. And he brings a letter and says, "I want you to cure me of my leprosy." Well, the king didn't know what in the world he was talking about. And then it dawned on the king. He goes, "I know what you're up to. You know I can't cure you of leprosy. So now you're going to go back to the king of Aram and tell him, and they're going to come over and raid us again, just like they always do. All you're doing is looking for an excuse to come back and raid and steal from us once more." But fortunately, word leaked out what was going on. Verse 8. When Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his robes, he sent him this message: "Why have you torn your robes? Have the man come to me, and he will know," a key verse, "he will know there is a prophet in Israel." So Naaman went with his horses and his chariots, and he stopped at the door of Elisha's house. Elisha sent a messenger to him to say, "Go wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan, and your flesh will be restored, and you will be cleansed." Verse 11, Naaman went away angry and said, what are those next 2 words? "I thought." Those are the 2 most dangerous words in the Bible. Those are the 2 most dangerous words in our walk with God. How many times have "I thought" run you in a ditch? So anyway, he says, "I thought that he would surely come out to see me and stand out and call out my name, call out the name of the Lord his God, wave his hand over the spot, and cure me of my leprosy. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than any of the waters of Israel? Couldn't I wash in them and be cleansed?" So he turned away and went away in a rage. So let's use our imagination here just a little bit. Let's put yourself in that situation. You know, Elisha the prophet lived outside the city there in probably just a small hut. Prophets were poor in those days. And the people of the village probably looked out and they seen all these chariots and all these horses coming. And what do you think they thought? Here come the Armenians again. They're going to raid us. They're going to steal from us, take the women, take the children, take anything of value, go to the hills, go to the ravines, any place you can find to hide, and let's get away from them. So Naaman arrives up in front of Elisha's house, and everybody's gone. And he thinks Elisha's going to come out and bow down to him because he is so important. And he expected Elisha to do some magic. He says, and he expected him to wave his hands over the spot. And he thought Elisha would read some words or do some incantations or maybe make up some sort of poultice. But do something, of magical to kind of cure him. So he waits. Nothing happens. And finally, Elisha doesn't come out at all. He sends a messenger. He sends some kid out that helps him. And he says, my master said, go dunk yourself 7 times in the Jordan, and you'll be cured. And he turns and he walks away, goes back in the house. And Naaman is furious. Naaman is beyond furious. Naaman is that biting nails into furious. And he's standing there thinking, I don't need a bath. Okay, my problem isn't cleanliness. My problem is leprosy. And here's where this lesson starts to take application in our lives and starts to make an impact on our lives. That's you and me. God, I don't see the connection. I know what my needs are, God. I know what my problem is, God. And yeah, God, I heard your solution, but I don't see the connection. I thought, and we go right back to those words again. I thought, but what is the relationship? It's the name. What's the relationship between having leprosy and dunking myself in some river that, for all I know about it, it's dirty and it's filthy? What's the connection? Aren't Abana and Pharpar a lot closer and a lot cleaner? This muddy Jordan is probably just going to give me infection on top of everything else. I don't see the relationship. For you see, when God asks you, or God asks me through his word, or through the power of Holy Spirit on my heart, or through someone in authority that I respect, to do something that doesn't make any sense, that's my problem. That's you, that's me, standing outside the door of Elisha's house beside Naaman going, I don't get it, God. I don't get it. God, if you'll just explain it to me, if you'll just tell me what the connection is, I'll go along with you, God, because, after all, God, I'm a pretty reasonable man. But just tell me the connection. And I like the parts of the Bible that says do this, and here's why, and don't do this, and here's why. But when you just out of the blue tell me to do something, or to change something, or out of your word give me some instruction that doesn't seem to fit my lifestyle, and it doesn't seem to fit today's culture, and it doesn't seem to fit my finances, and it doesn't seem to fit my circle of friends, God, help me see the connection. And all of a sudden, Naaman is faced with the same dilemma that you and I are faced with from time to time. Will we trust God when he withholds what we consider to be pertinent information? Will we trust God when he says, you move, just trust me? Will we trust God when he says, here's what I want you to do, and I want you to trust me? And I have a reason. And in time, you'll understand the reason. But before I allow you to understand, the next move's yours. That's when it gets real difficult for us. You see, it's the kind of faith And it's the kind of trust that is the essence of our Christian life and of our walk with God. Our relationship with God is based on the same thing any good relationship's based on, and that's trust. And even though I don't understand, I trust that you have my best interest in mind. And even though when you withhold what I consider to be pertinent information, I trust you. I'm stepping out. I'm moving on. And if you're here today and you're in one of those situations and God's talking to you to move, or maybe God's telling you, to make a change in your personal life or your group of friends, or change in the way you run your finances or handle your relationships, then the question is, do we trust God? He wants you to, change something about what's going on in your Christian service. And God, says, I'm not going to tell you the next step until you make a move. And we say, God, I just don't see how that's going to bless me. I don't see how I'm going to prosper from that. But the issue really is, and what we need to focus on, is not how smart God is, not has God fallen asleep at the wheel. The issue is, can we trust God? And one of the reasons that God does withhold information sometimes, one of the reasons he doesn't tell us all the why up front, isn't because there isn't a why. He doesn't go around just making up rules for us. We look back to the Garden of Eden. One rule. One rule. But God knows how we are. When God says, here's what I want you to do and here's why, a lot of times we start trusting in our own intellect and our own reasoning and leave God out of the picture. We jump from the what to the why and miss the who. We jump from the what, what am I going to do? Why am I going to do it? And oftentimes we are in a mode where we are supposedly obeying God, and yet God isn't even involved in the process. We are simply asking God to bless what we're doing, not what he wants us to do. And sometimes the longer we hear this and do this, it can become a routine, and it can become a habit, and it can become a lifestyle. And every once in a while, God comes along and says, I'm going to rock your little boat. I need to get your attention. I need to see if your priorities are straight. Because God said this is all about a relationship. And it's not about routine. It's not about spiritual discipline. It's about a relationship, and I want you to know, can you trust me? And of course we say, okay, God, what's behind your back? Just give me some sort of clue. And God says, no. I want this for one reason and one reason only. I want you to do it out of faith. I want you to do it out of trust. And once you step out and once you obey, you'll understand and you'll look back and say, that makes perfect sense. But God says, I want you to make that step first. I don't want you to trust in your own abilities. I don't want you to trust in your ability to reason things out and think things through. I want a relationship with you. So what do? Sometimes we act like our kids. But why, God? But why? You know what? Sometimes God's got to treat us like we treat our kids. Because I'm your dad, and I said so. Because I'm your mom, and I said so. God tells us that. Because I'm God, and I'm in charge. And I don't want you to trust in your own abilities. But when God tells us, do it because I'm in charge, because I told you so. That was another great saying on moms too. Why, Mom? Because I told you so. God tells us the same thing, but sometimes we don't react the same way. So anyway, here's Naaman, standing on the verge of a major decision, something that would change his life. But Naaman was lucky. He had some good accountability partners, so to speak, and they were smart enough to listen. We go on in verse 13. Naaman's servants went to him and said, "My father, if the prophet had told you to do something great, would you not have done it? And how much more then, when he tells you, wash and be cleansed?" So they tell the prophet Naaman, said, "Naaman, now if he had told you to do some great thing, go out and defeat this army, go invade this other land, would you not have done that?" And Naaman says, "Yeah, but I can see the connection between my bravery and me being rewarded for being cured." And they say, "So what's the big deal? Go and try." We should have accountability partners. There should be someone in your life that you have given permission to, that when they see something out of normal with you, when they see you acting a certain way or saying certain things or doing things, you ought to give someone permission to come up to you and look you in the face and go, "What are you doing? What's going on with you?" This is what happened here with Naaman. It goes on in verse 14. So he went down and dipped himself in the Jordan 7 times, as the man of God had told him. And his flesh was restored, and he became clean like that of a young boy. Then Naaman and all of his attendants, he took them all back with him, went back to the man of God. He stood before him and said, "Now I know that there is no God in all the world except the God of Israel." Naaman never mentioned leprosy again. It was just like leprosy wasn't an issue. He didn't go back to Elisha and go, "Look at me. I am clean. My skin is restored. I feel good again." He went back to Elisha and said, "Now I know there is no God in all the world except the God of Israel." And put yourself, this is one of my favorite stories out of the Old Testament. I like to kind of transform myself back in it. Put yourself in Naaman's position. You're out in the middle of the muddy old Jordan River. You're covered from head to foot with leprosy. All of the people under your authority, the people that you command in battle, are all lined up on horseback along the banks of the Jordan. Naaman's out there because they talked him into this. And you go down, you dunk yourself the first time, and you come up and you still got leprosy. You go down the second, the third, the fourth time, you're not cured. You go down number 5, number 6, come back up, and you're still covered. If you was Naaman, what would be going through your mind? I'm going to dunk this last time, but if I come up and nothing's changed, I'm going to be the laughing stock. I'm going to lose all my authority. I'm never going to be able to command this army out here that's watching me. I'm going to go back to my hometown, and I'm going to be ridiculed. But Naaman obeyed. Naaman was rewarded. And Naaman never mentions the problem of leprosy again. It's like it wasn't a problem. And because Naaman obeyed God when it didn't make any sense, his faith intersected with God's power, and all of a sudden, God became so real to him that he wound up not even talking about leprosy. He said, "Wow, I know there's a real God, and I know he's here, and I know he's here for me." Now, that's God's ultimate goal for us, to know him. If obedience was God's main goal, a few thunderbolts, a few plagues, he'd probably get our attention. And the tragedy of disobeying God is not simply the consequence of sin, although there are consequences. The tragedy of disobeying God when he asks us to do something that doesn't make any sense, we miss God. Because all through the Scripture, God reveals himself in critical moments when we obey, when it's going to cost us something, friendships, financially, our possessions. And when we obey when it doesn't make sense, when we step out in faith, at that moment God becomes real to us in our life more than at any other time. And we emerge knowing God is there and God's faithful. That's God's way. Again, I might change it if I was in charge, but I'm not. And that's God's way. He reveals himself in the greatest way when our faith intersects with his provision. And God tells us, you step out with faith, and I will interject my provision into your life and my involvement in your life. And sometimes we're just so busy to cultivate our daily relationship with God. And every once in a while, God just wants to put on the brakes and says, you need to listen to me. The story goes on. Naaman says, please accept now a gift from your servant. The prophet, this is Elisha, answered, as surely as the Lord lives, whom I serve, I will not accept a thing. And even though Naaman urged him, he refused. If you will not, said Naaman, please let your servant be given as much earth as a pair of mules can carry. For your servant will never again make burnt offerings or sacrifices to any other god, but to the Lord. So here's Naaman. He brings all these gifts because he figured he was going to have to pay for it. And besides, he's so overjoyed, he wouldn't care anyway. And he gets ready to go, and he says, well, if you're not going to take these gifts, could I have a couple of mule loads of dirt? And we sat there and we read that and we go, well, how goofy is that? But the way they thought back in that culture was, your God was a God of your dirt. My God was a God of my dirt. It would kind of be like having a God of Ohio and a God of Kentucky and a God of West Virginia. And if you came from West Virginia or you came from Kentucky and you thought that the God of Ohio was the real God and you wanted to worship him when you went back to your home, they thought in that culture that you had to bring back Ohio's dirt. And you would spread it out, in front of the altar so that when you went to worship, the God of Israel came with you and came with that dirt. Now, again, that sounds pretty goofy to us, but that's just kind of the way they thought back in. But the point is, Naaman forgot about leprosy because Naaman meant a real God. And the point of this message, and we'll wrap up, if you don't obey God, you're going to miss him. Because he exposes and reveals himself in the process of our obedience. That's how it does. That's how he does it. Naaman came to be cured of leprosy. God wanted to change and upgrade Naaman's life. So here is Naaman, pre-miracle, standing in front of Elisha's door, mad, furious. I don't see the connection. This is an insult. That doesn't make any sense. But what was at stake? It was not only his health issues, but his whole way of life. All of that hung in the balance. But before he obeyed, he didn't know what laid in the balance. And the tragedy of disobeying God and the tragedy of being at the crossroads and having to make a decision and turning around and walking away because it doesn't make any sense, you don't know what lays in the balance. You don't know what God would do if you obeyed him. It's more than a financial decision. It's more than a job change. It's more than how you conduct your relationships or your circle of friends. You just don't know what would happen if you'd step out and were obedient. You just don't know. And the tragedy is sometimes we live our whole lives and we just don't know what God could have done. As Emily and Luke and Virginia come forward, we're getting ready to sing, close things out here. That's the way God is. Remember Moses at the Red Sea. Pharaoh's army is coming to get him. They're closing in fast. The Red Sea's in front of them. What's God do? Moses, raise your staff. God, I don't see the connection between raising my staff and being overrun by the Pharaoh's army. But he obeyed. They got across. Moses looks back and goes, wow, am I glad I obeyed. Noah. God tells Noah, I want you to build an ark. Okay, God, what's an ark? Well, I'm going to make it rain. I'm going to make it flood. What's a flood, God? Matter of fact, God, what's rain? At that point, there's no explanation in the Bible. It hadn't even rained yet. But Noah obeyed. And he goes to building the ark, and all the people around him are making fun of him and insulting him. And I'm sure there was times his sons probably come up to him and go, Dad, what are we doing? And Noah probably says, we're just obeying God. The rains came, the floods came. Noah and his family said, man, I didn't know what hung in the balance when God told me to do this, but man, am I glad I obeyed. Or it can happen the other way too. We can walk away from whatever we know God's telling us to do. And we understand. Man, if you want a perfect example of this, read the second half of this story. Read about Gehazi and his, plan B, because we're expert at coming up with plans B's. And look what happened to him. Adam and Eve in the garden. Euphoria. Don't eat of the tree. Well, they ate of the tree. They knew why, but it was too late. And they suffered the consequence of that. So as you stand here this morning, I think our closing hymn is 490. It says, Lord, I'm coming home. If you've got something that God's been talking to you about this morning, if you got something God's been banging on your heart, if you're here this morning and you're at the crossroads and you've got to make a decision, and you know what your problem is, and you kind of know what God's telling you, but it doesn't seem to fit with your lifestyle or today's culture or whatever it is, better go with what God's telling you. Stand with us. If you need to talk about something, if you need to pray, the altar is always open.